Oh, oh, hey, 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 ooh, 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 so lying. Hey, hey, what's with you today? If it's a band, then you have to say la, 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 la.
Okay, now can you say it like you mean it? Try again. Much better. I'd like to suggest to you, if you work in the field of education and you're working with kids, you're involved in the only profession that looks to change the human brain every day. Well, somebody's got a bit excited over there. Because every time you engage in a new or novel activity, or every time you do repetition things, you're actually changing the neural architecture of the human brain. It can happen in an instant. You believe me? Huh! Fantastic. An award for the people in the cheap seats back there. Now, what actually happened then, and I saw some people in the front jump too, you didn't elude me, is in that moment, your brainstem and limbic system would have sent powerful messages to your frontal lobe saying, what is that? What is that? Do I run away? What do I do? Do I fight it? What do I do? And your frontal lobes have said, relax, it's just a fool on a stage. But in that moment, the neural architecture of your brain would have changed, just like that. Okay? You would have had dendrite growth in particular regions. You would have had some neurons. It would have changed. And it happens just like that. That's one of the most amazing things about the human brain. And here, if you look here, in the first year, look at how much the brain has shaped itself. It actually is more familiar or similar to an adult in terms of how it works than its 5-day-old sibling. So a lot happens in the early stages of life. I often find the crowds are incredibly responsive, whether they be teachers or students or parents, because most people are really genuinely interested in how the brain develops and what we might learn from it in terms of behavior and learning. And so it's always invigorating and a bit of an adrenaline rush for me. Deprivation of stimulation is far more problematic than trying to hyperstimulate kids, okay, in a sense. So if we deprive kids of stimulation, that's really problematic. Now, again, we have kids that are 4 and 5 years of age in the United States and Canada with huge anxiety disorders because they're trying to be hyperstimulated. I've been in some prep classes where the expectation is that kids in that class will be doing what year ones are doing. Completely developmentally inappropriate. Okay? I've also, and now we have pre-prep. So we're prepping for prep. We do not have to hyperstimulate kids. We do not have to build their CV by the time they're 5 or 6. Because if we try to do that, we might be stressing them more than anything else. How many, for example, this is how important it is. How many of you have incorrect pencil grip? How many of you arrived at school and your teacher said, you hold that thing wrong? And they spent the better part of primary years trying to teach you how to hold it properly. And it didn't work, did it? Because early in life, you got a hold of a utensil that was designed for the manual dexterity of an adult, and your brain compensated for it. Right? And they tried to fix that. We know that if you try to get kids to do things they're not ready for, it can be really problematic.
I think I found it really quite fascinating considering the holistic view of children and the environments that we create to raise happy, healthy children. When you think of communities, what level of stress do we have in communities? What level of stress do we have in our families, in our homes, in the schools, in the early childhood settings in which we're trying to educate our children? I think one of the things Michael was really good at helping us to understand is how do we as people living in community, how do we as educators, how do we as teachers help create the best environments and understanding how the brain develops and how the brain works to create some really lovely environments to get the best out of children.
And a lot of it has to do with an important material called myelin. Have you heard of that? Myelin is the white matter of the brain. It's a fatty material, okay? It's a fat. And the more you have, the better, okay? Now, myelin grows in fits and starts in different regions of the brain at different times. It's not a nice linear sort of thing. The brain does not mature in linear. It kind of matures from the back to the front, from the inside out, but a lot of it is related to myelin. Okay, so at birth, children have very few myelinated axons for sight. So in the first few weeks of life, children need to see things, axons need to be myelinated, sight develops. Get the idea? And myelin wraps around the axons of neurons, and it acts as an insulator and conductor. Full myelination of the human brain does not occur until we're in our 20s. So we know we take almost 30 years to become fatheads. But the more of it we have, the better. And you can't accelerate it, okay? But we do know some interesting things. The brain, again, is a powering mechanism, and if it feels stress, it does some of these things, okay? It reverts to tried and true behaviors, often becomes overreactive and impulsive, and it shuts down thinking. We're going to talk about why that is. Okay, and it can shut it down in an instant. Any idea why I put a woolly mammoth up here? It's dead. Stress equals death. One of the most interesting things about the human brain from an evolutionary standpoint, and we've got people who study this over and over and over again, is that the mechanisms of our mind that have allowed us to survive, our stress mechanisms, haven't changed. So a millennium ago, when these beasts were walking the earth, if a tribesman or tribeswoman, we'll say tribesman because there was no political correctness then. But if a tribesman came across this beast, they might go into a stress response. And that stress response would be, do I kill it? Do I have the requisite spears and personnel? Or do I run away? Now, and the mechanisms of the mind put those things in order. If you walked out of this room and you saw this thing, you would go through the same process, the exact same process. What has changed are the things that stress us. And it's the same with kids. Different things stress kids in different ways. I often get asked by parents, when I take my child to school for the very first time, what should I do? And of course, my response is, you drop them there and you say, see ya, and you leave. Free at last, I'm free at last. Now, we know that when kids go into an environment that they're unfamiliar with, you have to make the unfamiliar familiar, right? Otherwise, they can go into a stress response. Now, here's the important thing. When a child goes into a stress response, and an adult goes into a stress response, those chemicals that are happening are the same. The problem is, for a child, their brain is still developing, and often they have difficulty processing that, where you learn to deal with it. When you're engaged in some measure, or having to endure some measure of tolerable stress, it sends an alarm signal, and it heightens your body for respond, to survive. And then once, it might take a short bit of time or a long period of time, once that signal diminishes, you go back to homeostasis, normalcy, okay? And so if there's a death in the family, that could take a little bit of time, right? The problem with toxic stress is this. You never come back to homeostasis. And so if you live in abject poverty, you're often elevated stress-wise. If you're in a situation, we know that kids in Christchurch in New Zealand who aren't living in abject poverty, but they're stressed. You see, because they had the earthquake, but the ground continues to shake. And every time it shakes, they go to a heightened state of stress response. Now, that is problematic because the chemicals that are released for stress were designed for short-term purposes only. They're designed to kill the mammoth or run away, not to be in your system repeatedly over and over and over again. And we know that chronic stress, this is interesting, studies with adults who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic stress, we find that their hippocampi are shrinking, physically shrinking. Now, the hippocampi are a region of the brain that you process short-term memory and your working memory. So when you go to sleep tonight, it's your hippocampi that talks to the rest of the brain and says, what's important to remember? And it processes short-term memories. So people who have PTSD or have been chronically stressful environments, we see physical evidence where the hippocampi is actually shrinking. And unlike other areas of the brain, we don't have any evidence to suggest that it repairs itself. Once the damage is done, it's done. Cortisol is really easy to measure. If we swabbed your saliva, we add some requisite chemicals, we see how elevated your cortisol levels are. Cortisol's fundamental job is to shut down your frontal lobes, to shut down thinking, to ensure your survival. And it's only when cortisol returns to normal that you have clarity of thought. This is one of the reasons why, if someone sends you an email and it elicits an emotional response, they say, wait 24 hours. And what do most of us do? And you feel better. And then you get another one back, and it's a perpetuating thing. So that's what cortisol's job is. When it is in your system elevated for long periods of time, that's the chemical that actually shrinks the hippocampus. It damages memory. It impairs thinking, and it also creates anxious behavior. Kids with elevated cortisol are anxious kids.
Michael affirmed so many points about the importance of evidence-based practice that it just goes without saying that I guess an education sector needs to be partnering with some of the other professionals and other areas of research and literature to really move forward with some of the ideas around how to shape the experiences for young children, how to support the work that early educators do, not only in their classrooms but in the dialogue with parents as well about the best possible start that we can be providing children with, because that's our future society too, and what we can achieve and do now has benefits for all of us into the long term. So I was really excited to have some of those clues and some of those ideas from the research to be sharing in my everyday work with families whose children aren't necessarily doing so well with development yet, but how we can work together to enhance that.
So, but do we stress our kids? One of the most interesting ones is homework. Across the board, I like the fact that I always find it interesting is that if you look at policies and frameworks around homework, they often make some really interesting claims. Homework builds lifelong learning. Homework enhances time management skills. Homework does this, homework does that. They never cite the evidence, and they don't because there isn't any. In fact, most of the evidence around homework suggests that what it probably does more than anything else is it stresses kids, stresses teachers, stresses families, parents. And we don't do it well. In fact, in many places, I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the United States, many states in the United States, homework wasn't allowed up until the mid-1980s because it was deemed psychologically damaging. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-anything. I just think that if you're going to do something, do it with the best of evidence. Now, what is also interesting is that the evidence in terms of what kids should do at home is actually paradoxical to what we do. See, most of the evidence in homework suggests that when kids are little, that's a good time to do things at home. You see, when they're developing really important skills in terms of literacy and numeracy, it's those types of things that need to be repeated. And it's those types of things that parents can actually do. You know, 1 + 1 = 2. When you have to do trigonometry, it gets really problematic. Right? And not only that, when kids are little, they don't see it as homework. They see it completely different. But we have this sort of notion that the older you get, the more you should do. And it's highly problematic. You know, open your book to page 294, do all the odd questions. Why? I can do the first one. Now, the International Maths and Science Skills Aptitude Test is an interesting thing because politicians like to point to things and say, we're not doing as well. Right? They look at PISA and they say, Australia's ranked 14th. So what? And why would you want to compare to other countries anyway? The International Maths and Science Skills Aptitude is a similar thing to PISA. They look at science and math skills in 28 industrialized nations. Now, there's an interesting part of that. In the last one, if you look at it, there's a graph that kind of goes like this, okay, a bar graph. Countries that do poorly in terms of math and science skills aptitude, countries that do really well. And of course, the key question is why? Why is that? So they look at different factors. Well, you go a little bit further into the report, there's a thing on homework, and the graph goes like this. In other words, the countries that are doing poorly in math and science do more homework than the ones that don't. And I think there's part of this is this. If you can't achieve what you need to achieve in school with a teacher in 6 hours a day for 200 days a year, then you need to look at what is it we're trying to do in that time. Because how many of you want to go home and do homework? Why would you expect a 10, 12, 14, 8-year-old to want to? The younger they are, the better, because they don't see it that way. Does that make sense to you? And we see this over and over and over again. And also what a lot of kids, particularly little kids, talk about is how they have to do so much. How they have to do so much. That's why I call life is too fast. They talk about being too busy. And that's really problematic because kids need downtime. We could break into songs sooner than you think. Yes, singing's important. Yes. Play is important. Very important. We're going to talk about the importance of play. But also, one of the things that's really important and we often don't give enough credit to is how you respond and listen. See, there's a lot of research that tells us the level of response you get engages kids intrinsically. Right? I mentioned the importance of play. I mentioned the importance of parent. This is also important. You people do amazing things with kids, and people should be patting you on the back more. In fact, I think what you do is far more beneficial than worrying about who teaches physics. Doesn't interest me. I'd like to say to you that the fact that you're here today suggests you're probably doing the right things anyway. You probably didn't need to hear me. And I'd say, I really thank you for your time. I hope you've learned something, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Whoa, hey, 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 ooh, ooh, so lying. Hey, hey, what's with you today? If it's a band, then you have to say la 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 la.